The prisoners sat huddled in the dark, their bodies weakened by the ceaseless cold that seemed to gnaw at their bones. The bitter winds howled through the barracks, slipping through the cracks in the poorly constructed walls like the fingers of death itself. It had been months since their capture, and the snow had come early this year, blanketing the camp in a thick, suffocating layer of white. It seemed as if winter would never end, just as the hunger, the pain, and the constant threat of violence had become part of the prisoners' daily existence. They were men of various nationalities, captured during raids across the continent. The Germans had left no distinction between soldier and civilian, treating all as enemies of the Reich. Some of the prisoners were barely recognizable as soldiers anymore. Their uniforms had long been reduced to tatters, their faces gaunt from the lack of food and the relentless cold. They had been promised that their captors would keep them alive for the duration of the war, but with each passing day, it seemed increasingly unlikely that any of them would make it out alive. In the early days of their captivity, they had held onto the faint hope that they would be rescued. They had clung to the idea that the war would soon end, that the Allies would break through the German lines and liberate them from the hell they had been thrown into. But those days had passed, and with them, the optimism that had once fueled their spirits. Now, as the snow continued to fall and the temperature dropped to unbearable levels, the hope of rescue seemed as distant as the sun itself. What they had come to understand was that their survival depended on something far more basic and primal than the faint hope of outside intervention. It depended on the strength they could summon from within. The nights were the worst. The freezing air cut through the camp, turning the barracks into a graveyard of frozen bodies. There were no blankets, no warm clothing to keep out the cold. The only warmth came from the bodies pressed together in makeshift shelters, but even that was fleeting. The frostbite on their toes and fingers became a common affliction, as did the constant coughing from the damp, cold air that seeped into their lungs. Yet, it was not just the physical pain that wore them down. It was the mental anguish, the waiting, the helplessness. Each night seemed endless, a cycle of despair that repeated itself with excruciating predictability. The guards were indifferent to their suffering. The German officers, arrogant and brutal, rarely even glanced in their direction unless it was to issue a punishment or deliver a verbal insult. The prisoners had long since given up any hope of kindness or compassion from their captors. There were occasional attempts to break the prisoners' spirits, to impose arbitrary rules that made survival even more difficult. But the Germans underestimated the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the cold, despite the hunger, the prisoners found ways to endure. They shared what little food they had, spoke in hushed tones about their families and loved ones, and occasionally even found moments of levity, however brief, to break the crushing monotony. Yet, even in their darkest moments, they could not ignore the constant threat of what was to come. The German officers had spoken little of their plans, but the prisoners could sense the growing tension in the air. There were rumors of mass executions, of transports to far-off camps where survival was even more unlikely. Some of the men had already begun to lose their minds, speaking to themselves in frenzied whispers or staring vacantly into space, as if already dead in spirit. The war had turned these men into ghosts, hollowed-out shells of their former selves. The only thing that kept them alive was the faint hope that, somehow, they would make it through. That hope, however, was quickly eroding. And then one night there was a change. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it did not go unnoticed by the prisoners. They had become attuned to the rhythms of the camp, the daily routines that governed their lives, and this shift felt different. The wind that howled through the trees seemed to carry with it a new kind of chill, a deeper, more foreboding cold. The prisoners gathered around the flickering lights of their shelters, trying to avoid the frostbite that seemed to spread faster than the cold itself. Their eyes, though weary, were sharp enough to catch the first signs of something strange. The German patrols, usually a constant presence, were fewer. There were murmurs that some of the soldiers had been reassigned, sent elsewhere to shore up the faltering front lines. That, too, was a double-edged sword. With fewer guards, the prisoners had more freedom of movement, at least for a time. But it also meant that they were now more vulnerable. The absence of the guards felt like a countdown to an unknown, perhaps even more dangerous fate. The isolation was growing, and the isolation was killing them in ways that the cold and the hunger could not. Yet, within this new atmosphere of uncertainty, a strange event occurred, one that none of them could have predicted. It was during one of those bitterly cold nights when the winds seemed to be driving them into the very ground that they noticed something across the horizon. The camp was surrounded by trees, thick with snow and darkened by the lack of any real illumination. The light from the German campfires barely reached the edge of the camp, but in the distance, something stood out against the snow, a steady glow, faint but persistent. The lights of the nearby British POW camp, which had once been thought to be too far off to matter, now shone clearly through the dark, flickering through the night like distant stars in the heavens. For the prisoners, the sight of the lights was a revelation, a glimmer of hope that they had not allowed themselves to believe in for months. They had long since assumed that the British camp, like so many others, had fallen to the same fate. That any hope of outside intervention was a cruel joke. But the lights were there, stubborn and unyielding, cutting through the darkness with a clarity that spoke volumes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the prisoners allowed themselves a moment of hope. It was not just that the lights provided a sense of warmth, however fleeting. It was that they symbolized something greater, the defiance of the British, the unwavering resolve of a force that had refused to yield in the face of the most horrific circumstances. The prisoners could not help but marvel at the fact that, despite the surrounding chaos and suffering, the British lights remained on. It was as if they were saying to the prisoners, to everyone within reach of that light, that they were not forgotten. That, somehow, there was still a reason to hold on. In the freezing darkness of the camp, the prisoners held onto that beacon like a lifeline, clinging to it as the cold continued to press in on them from all sides. For the first time in months, they began to speak of something other than survival. They spoke of hope, of escape, of freedom. The lights became a rallying point, a symbol of everything they had almost forgotten to believe in. The harsh winter that had threatened to break them now became a test of their will to hold on. The lights were there, across the frozen expanse, shining brightly through the darkness, a promise that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. As the days dragged on in the frozen POW camp, the prisoners found themselves trapped in a cycle of despair and exhaustion. The chill of the bitter winter seemed to have seeped into their bones, making every breath feel like an effort, every movement a burden. The nights were the worst, as the cold wrapped itself around them like a vice, pinning them down in a suffocating silence. The once lively discussions, even in hushed tones, about the possibility of rescue or the hope of liberation had long since ceased. Now, the men had grown accustomed to the relentless oppression, the endless suffering. They no longer spoke of freedom. It had become a dream so distant that it seemed impossible to even imagine. The prisoners' routines had become a grim choreography of survival. The barracks, overcrowded and poorly constructed, had become little more than a holding pen for the broken men who had been captured in the early months of the war. The walls were thin, and the floors were damp from the constant melt of snow that leaked in from the outside. With no insulation to speak of, the cold permeated everything, making it feel as if even the air had turned against them. They had been forced into this harsh environment, their bodies battered and bruised from months of brutality and deprivation. The bitter winds that blew through the trees seemed to mock their suffering, carrying with them a cruelty that made every night feel like the longest of their lives. Despite the freezing temperatures, the prisoners were expected to perform tasks, menial, degrading labor that seemed designed more to break their spirit than to contribute to any real war effort. They were marched out each morning to work on fortifications, digging trenches or moving supplies under the watchful eye of their German captors. The work was grueling, and the men were given little more than a handful of bread and water each day. Even the most basic human needs, like sleep and warmth, had been stripped away, leaving the men hollow and raw, not just physically but mentally as well. The constant strain of this existence, coupled with the crushing knowledge that the world outside was falling apart, had left them feeling like they were fading away, one moment at a time. The food they were given was barely enough to sustain them. The rations were meager and often spoiled or infested with insects. The bread, hard as stone, had become the mainstay of their diet, a tasteless, dry lump that left them hungry no matter how much they ate. There were times when they would dream of something as simple as a warm meal, something other than the gruel they were served in the morning. But those dreams, like everything else, had faded into the background of their new reality. They had learned to subsist on what little they had, rationing even the smallest crumbs and sharing whatever scraps they could find. The cold was the enemy they could not escape. It seemed to come from all directions, from the open doors of the barracks, from the gaps in their clothing, from the very air itself. The men had come to understand that the cold was not merely a physical sensation. It was a force, an oppressive entity that threatened to take their souls as much as their lives. Their fingers were numb from the frost, their toes stiff and swollen from the biting chill. The lack of proper footwear had turned their feet into blistered, bleeding messes, and many of the prisoners had begun to lose sensation in their extremities. The frostbite spread like a plague, claiming men who had once been strong, reducing them to a state of near death. The prisoners had learned to rely on one another, sharing what little warmth they had, huddling together for any fleeting sense of comfort. The German officers, meanwhile, were indifferent to their suffering. They were cold, calculating, and brutal in their treatment of the men. Every day they issued new orders, random, pointless tasks meant to break their will. They would shout commands, driving the prisoners to work harder, faster, and longer without any consideration for the men's exhaustion or suffering. Some of the guards would smile with sadistic pleasure as they watched the prisoners struggle, knowing that they had broken them. They would mock them in German, calling them weak and pathetic, their words sharp as knives. The prisoners, though they were still soldiers in spirit, were forced to endure the humiliation, knowing that resistance would only make their suffering worse. Yet, despite the brutality of the guards and the bitter cold that threatened to break them, the prisoners found small moments of defiance in their misery. It was in these fleeting moments that the spark of rebellion, however faint, would flicker. The men had become adept at stealing glances at one another, sharing quiet words of encouragement, and finding solace in their shared suffering. There were no longer any divisions between nationalities, no longer any distinctions between the soldiers who had once fought for different countries. The bonds of war had welded them together into a single, united force. They were no longer just a collection of prisoners. They were a brotherhood forged in the fires of hardship, each man fighting to preserve what little humanity remained. The guards, for all their cruelty, could not break the men's spirits entirely. There were moments when the prisoners would sneak a smile at one another, a look of silent understanding passing between them. They would share a brief laugh, a hushed word of solidarity, a fleeting sense of connection that reminded them that they were still alive, still human. These small gestures, though almost imperceptible, were enough to keep the men going. They had come to realize that their survival depended not just on their physical endurance, but on their ability to hold on to something, anything, that could remind them of the world they had once known. The worst of the suffering came in the night, when the temperature dropped even further. It was during these long, sleepless hours that the prisoners would lie in the dark, shivering uncontrollably, staring at the cold ceiling above them. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and desperation, and the only sounds were the rustling of bodies shifting in search of warmth and the occasional cough or groan of pain. The cold was inescapable, and the men were powerless to stop it. They would press their bodies together in a desperate attempt to stay warm, hoping that the heat from their comrades would provide even the slightest relief. But it never did. The cold remained a constant, gnawing presence, refusing to let go. In the midst of this unrelenting suffering, a strange thing began to happen. The prisoners, despite the brutality of their circumstances, began to change. They no longer saw themselves as mere victims, waiting for the end. The realization began to dawn on them that survival, true survival, was not just about enduring the physical hardships, but about finding strength in the face of hopelessness. The very fact that they were still alive, still holding on to the tiniest thread of hope, was an act of defiance. It was as if the very act of surviving, of holding on, had become a rebellion against the forces that sought to crush them. It was during this time, in the depths of their suffering, that the prisoners began to notice something strange, something that, for all its simplicity, would come to mean everything. Across the distance, faint but persistent, they saw the lights of the British camp, shining through the night like a beacon. At first, they thought little of it, assuming it was some sort of mirage or hallucination brought on by the cold and hunger. But as the days passed, the lights remained, burning brightly in the distance, unwavering through the snow and the darkness. The prisoners, exhausted as they were, could not help but feel a flicker of hope when they saw those lights. It was as if, in that moment, the world had reminded them that they were not alone, that there was something beyond the frozen desolation they were trapped in. The lights were a sign, a faint yet powerful symbol that, despite everything, there was still hope, hope that would prove to be the very thing that kept them alive. The moment the prisoners first noticed the lights, they barely allowed themselves to believe it. For weeks, the nights had been nothing but endless stretches of freezing darkness, with the occasional flicker of the camp's solitary light bulbs barely illuminating the barren landscape around them. The Germans, as indifferent as ever, had made no effort to maintain any sense of warmth or security in their camp. The POWs were left to suffer in the harsh, unrelenting cold, and their bodies had begun to break down in ways that words could scarcely describe. Yet, in the distance, across the snow-covered expanse that separated them from the nearest Allied camp, there was something that they had not expected to see, a glimmer, faint but unyielding, cutting through the frost like a beacon of defiance. At first, it was hard to make out. Through the bitter cold and the whipping winds, it could have been a trick of the eyes, a mirage formed by the chill air. Some of the prisoners were reluctant to speak of it, unsure if acknowledging it would mean giving in to some impossible fantasy. The reality of their situation had taught them not to hope. Hope had been a luxury they could no longer afford. Over the weeks and months of deprivation and brutality, their dreams had been eroded down to something far less romantic: survival. But that night, as they huddled together in their freezing barracks, the glow from the distant British camp became undeniable. It pierced the dark landscape with a quiet brilliance, flickering against the abyss, a silent testament to endurance. The men had learned long ago that they were not meant to survive, at least not in any meaningful way. The German guards made it clear that they were to be forgotten, relegated to the shadows of the war as expendable pawns. The food was minimal, the work degrading, and the nights were longer than they had ever been in their worst nightmares. They had become ghosts of their former selves, mere shells driven forward by the mechanics of survival. What had once been men of ambition, of promise, were now reduced to exhausted, hollow figures. The relentless cold was not just a physical burden. It was an erasure of the self. The bodies of the prisoners were no longer their own, but a mere collection of parts clinging to life by sheer will. So when they first saw the lights, many of them hesitated to even speak of it. Could this really be the sign they had all but abandoned hope for? They were buried deep within enemy lines, trapped in an isolated, forgotten corner of a war that seemed endless. The distant glow was too faint to be a clear message, too far away to be anything more than an illusion. Yet, as the hours passed, and as they continued to peer through the cracks in the walls of their barracks, it became clearer, more distinct. There was something undeniably real about it. There was no mistaking it. The lights were there, and they were staying. As the realization settled in, the mood among the prisoners began to shift. The darkness, which had been their constant companion, felt a little less suffocating. The cold, which had felt like a physical manifestation of their despair, seemed to lose some of its sharpness. Even though the lights from the British camp were far away, too far for any immediate rescue, they brought with them a new kind of hope. It wasn't a loud, triumphant hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that rang in one's chest with the promise of an imminent victory. No, this was quieter, subtler. It was the kind of hope that filled the small, invisible cracks in their spirits, offering something to cling to when everything else seemed intent on pulling them under. The British lights were a constant, steady reminder that they had not been forgotten. The German guards, unaware or perhaps unconcerned, carried on with their routines. They were busy with their own duties, managing the logistics of the war as best they could in the face of mounting defeats. The prisoners were far from the front lines, and the enemy knew that they posed no threat in their weakened state. But to the men in the camp, those lights across the expanse of snow began to grow into something more than just a physical phenomenon. They represented resistance, endurance, and most importantly, the idea that someone out there was still fighting for them, that the world beyond the barbed wire still cared. The prisoners did not speak openly of their growing awareness of the lights. It was almost too fragile to mention, too tentative to discuss without fear that it might break into nothingness. In a place like this, hope had no place to take root. Every glimmer of it had been smothered by the relentless brutality of their captors, and they had learned not to set themselves up for disappointment. But as the nights passed and the lights remained constant, they began to quietly share the knowledge with one another. Some nodded, acknowledging it with a glance. Others whispered about it in the shadows of the barracks, their voices low and careful, as if speaking of it might somehow make it disappear. A few even allowed themselves to imagine what it might mean. Could the British be planning a rescue? Were the lights a sign of something larger, something they could not yet see? The idea of rescue began to take root in the minds of some of the men, though it was tempered by the grim reality of their situation. For months, they had been told to expect nothing but their own survival. Their hopes for a quick end to the war had been dashed time and again by the stalemate of the front lines and the brutal, impersonal march of time. But now, for the first time in months, they began to wonder if there was a possibility, however small, that their lives could be saved. The realization was so foreign, so at odds with the world they had come to accept, that it left them both uneasy and electrified. Could they dare to dream again? Could the light from the British camp mean anything more than an illusion, a cruel reminder of the life they had lost? The men began to watch the lights with more intention. They marked the passage of time by the way the lights flickered in the distance, by how long they stayed on, how strong they burned. There was something so remarkable about it, that those lights, in the midst of a war that had torn everything apart, could burn so brightly through the darkness. And the more they watched, the more the prisoners began to see the lights as something they could hold on to, something that was not just physical but symbolic of their resilience. The idea that, despite everything, despite the freezing cold, despite the hunger and the deprivation, there were still people out there who were willing to fight for them, to hold on to the light, was enough to inspire something deep within them. The lights brought them something they hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection. It wasn't just the British soldiers who were keeping the lights on. It was the idea that there was a greater force, a larger collective, that was invested in their survival, that was standing against the cruelty of their captors. The lights became an emblem of defiance, of everything they had once been, and everything they could still be. Even in the face of death, of isolation, the idea that they were not forgotten, that they were part of something larger than themselves, allowed them to withstand the cold a little longer, to hold onto the small fragments of their humanity that the Germans sought to strip away. In the days that followed, the lights from the British camp became more than just a distant reminder of hope. They became a symbol of resistance, a flame that burned brightly in the darkness of the prisoners' souls. They began to see it not just as a sign of rescue, but as a promise that no matter how bleak their situation, they were not alone. The war, in all its brutal indifference, could take their lives, but it could not extinguish the light of resistance, nor the strength that they could draw from it. The lights remained, constant and unwavering, burning through the winter night, a silent testament to the endurance of the human spirit. And so, they clung to the glow, drawing from it a new kind of strength, quiet, steady, unyielding. It was the light they would follow, even if it seemed distant, even if it seemed unreachable. It was the light that reminded them, in the coldest hours, that they were still alive. As the days wore on and the winter's grip tightened, the faint but constant glow from the British camp became a symbol that no one in the POW camp could ignore. At first, the prisoners had shared nothing more than passing glances and whispered remarks about the lights. It was the kind of fleeting hope they didn't want to voice too loudly, lest it slip through their fingers like so many other dreams that had been dashed. But as the lights persisted, steady and unwavering, they began to do something even more powerful than they could have imagined. They began to change the way the men in the camp thought about themselves, about their situation, and about their futures. The distant glow was no longer just a reminder of what was beyond the barbed wire. It had become a beacon, a lighthouse in the storm. It was a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of something that transcended the horrors of their captivity. The shift in the prisoners' collective spirit was palpable, though subtle at first. A low hum began to permeate the barracks, not of noise, but of something deeper, a sense of shared purpose. They were, for the first time in months, aware that they had been seen, that they had not been forgotten. In their darkest hours, when the cold seemed too much to bear and the hunger gnawed at them like a slow, steady death, they would steal glances at the lights, reassuring themselves that there was something out there, something waiting for them. The harsh reality of their captivity had stripped them of many things: dignity, comfort, and at times, even their own sense of identity, but the one thing it could not strip away was the desire to hold on to hope, however small it might be. But hope, as they had learned, was a fragile thing. To truly believe in it now, after everything they had endured, was an act of defiance. It was dangerous to hope, for it meant allowing themselves to feel something again, something beyond the endless suffering they had come to accept as their fate. Yet as the days turned to weeks and the lights continued to shine in the distance, the men began to ask themselves if they could afford not to hope. Could they allow themselves to perish in the cold without even trying to fight back? The answer, slowly but surely, began to come together as they spoke in whispers, at first tentative, then more certain. If there was a chance, no matter how slim, that someone out there cared enough to keep those lights on for them, then they had to act. They had to fight to stay alive. Not just to survive, but to survive with the dignity that had been so ruthlessly stripped from them. The change wasn't instantaneous. At first, they held the lights at arm's length, as if afraid that acknowledging their power would somehow make them disappear. But as the winter wore on, and the barracks grew colder and the nights longer, the prisoners began to speak more openly about the lights. They shared stories of their lives before the war, about their families, about the homes they had lost. These conversations, though rare, were enough to reignite something deep within them, a reminder of the world they had once known, a world that had been cruelly taken from them. Each man clung to the idea that they had not been forgotten, that there was still a reason to endure. The idea of escape, once a distant fantasy, began to surface more frequently in their conversations. Some of the men had already begun to plan their own attempts to break free, not that they shared these plans openly. They knew that the slightest misstep would result in punishment, or worse. The Germans had made it clear that there would be no mercy for anyone caught trying to escape. And yet, the thought of what might lie beyond the wire began to stir something in the prisoners' hearts. They could no longer simply wait for their inevitable deaths. They had to try, even if it meant facing a hopeless end. The men had seen enough of their fellow prisoners succumb to the cold, to the brutality of the guards, and to the silent suffering of the war. They had seen men who had given up, their faces empty, their spirits broken. They could not afford to join them. They would not. In the dim light of their barracks, with the wind howling outside and the cold seeping through every crack in the walls, the prisoners began to whisper of escape in earnest. It was an idea that felt almost impossible to entertain, but they were tired of feeling powerless, tired of being pushed down. The lights, faint though they were, gave them a kind of strength they hadn't known they had left. If the British were willing to endure, to hold their ground, so could they. It wasn't a grand gesture, but a quiet rebellion. The prisoners' willingness to even entertain the idea of escape was an act of resistance in itself, an act that pushed against the limitations placed on them by their captors. They would not simply lie down and die. But the Germans were not blind to the prisoners' growing awareness. They began to tighten their control over the camp, watching more closely for any signs of resistance or disobedience. The lights that had once seemed like a far-off dream of freedom were now seen as a threat to the German authority in the camp. The guards, who had once been content with administering the daily routine of cruelty and indifference, became more suspicious. They patrolled the perimeter more frequently, scanning the horizon for any sign that the prisoners were organizing, that they had caught wind of something greater. The prisoners, in turn, became more cautious, more subtle in their actions. They could no longer afford to be seen as hopeful or defiant. They had to mask their growing unity, their desire to do something beyond simply surviving. It was during these increasingly tense days that a few of the men took it upon themselves to learn more about the guards, to understand their routines and weaknesses. They studied the way the Germans interacted with each other, noting when the patrols were weakest, when the guards would be distracted, and where the gaps in the security might be. There was no grand plan, no escape mapped out in a way that could guarantee success. But they began to recognize that every small piece of information mattered. The guards were humans too, flawed and vulnerable in their own ways. If they could use that vulnerability to their advantage, even for a fleeting moment, they might stand a chance. And so, slowly but surely, the prisoners began to work in silence, using the shadows of the barracks to their advantage. They whispered of small acts of rebellion, of stealing food, of sabotaging work details, of quietly communicating with other camps in the area. They shared glances, quick and fleeting, that spoke volumes without saying a word. They didn't have much to go on, but the knowledge that the British lights were still burning, still steadfast, gave them the strength to push forward. The lights had ignited a spark that could not easily be extinguished, no matter how much the Germans tried to clamp down on their will. In the long, cold nights, as they lay together in the freezing barracks, the prisoners began to find solace in the thought that they were not alone. They were connected to something far bigger than the wire that separated them from the world. The British lights had shown them that the world outside still had a place for them, that they were not discarded, that they were worth fighting for. Even if that fight was small, even if it was little more than a whispered conversation or a stolen glance, it was a fight nonetheless. The prisoners, bound together by their shared suffering, began to understand that this fight was theirs to win. They didn't need the guards to know their plans. They didn't need the world to hear their cries. They only needed to believe in themselves, in each other, and in the quiet power of the light that had never faltered. It was a symbol, but it was also a promise, that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could burn just as brightly. The lights were their lifeline, and they would hold on to them no matter the cost. It was no longer just about escape. It was about reclaiming something they had lost, their will to resist, to stand firm, to defy the darkness. And that, in the end, was more powerful than any physical act of escape. The mood within the camp had shifted irreversibly. Once there had been despair, a quiet resignation to the notion that survival was all they could hope for, a numb acceptance that, in time, they would all either perish from hunger, cold, or the brutal hands of the Germans. But now, something else stirred among the prisoners. It was a growing sense of unity, a fragile, quiet strength that came from their shared suffering and the flickering lights in the distance. That faint glow, visible through the bare branches of the surrounding trees, was no longer just a sign of hope. It had become a source of defiance. The men began to see it not merely as a reminder of what they had lost, but as a challenge, a call to arms, one they could not ignore. It was a rallying point, a beacon that symbolized the possibility of resistance, of survival, and perhaps even of freedom. The lights were something solid to hold on to, a tether to the outside world, one that could not be severed, no matter how dire the situation became. And so, as the days passed and the situation grew even more precarious, the prisoners began to make quiet, tentative plans, not just to survive, but to endure with purpose. The Germans, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly vigilant. They had noticed the prisoners' change in behavior, the small, subtle shifts that indicated something more than mere compliance. It was the slightest movement of a hand, the brief glances exchanged in the corners of the camp, the way the prisoners now stood a little straighter when they marched, their faces no longer entirely hollow with despair. They had noticed the lights too, of course, but unlike the prisoners, the Germans saw them as a threat, something that could inspire rebellion. It was a danger they could not afford. Their task was to suppress, to break, to control, and the prisoners' newfound unity, their awareness of the lights, was a crack in their carefully constructed system of oppression. It was small, but it was enough. They had seen this before in other camps, small signs of resistance that could easily grow into something larger, something they could no longer control. The men were beginning to remember what it was to be human, to fight for something beyond mere existence, and that terrified the Germans. In response, the guards increased their patrols, their threats, and their arbitrary punishments. They sought to stifle any sign of unity, any flicker of resistance. They ordered the prisoners to work longer hours in the freezing cold, forcing them to dig trenches and transport supplies under the watchful eyes of armed soldiers. Any lapse in discipline was met with harsh punishment, and the few men who dared to show even the slightest sign of defiance were immediately singled out for brutal retribution. The guards, sensing the growing tension, sought to isolate the prisoners further, tightening their control over the camp with the precision of a machine that had learned to anticipate its prey's every move. They were masters of cruelty, and yet they, too, were becoming wary, knowing that they could not afford to lose control of the prisoners.